in Genesis, which I hope to cover in this one session. Having completed, well, we haven't completed, but it seems like we've completed the story of Joseph. Certainly Joseph remains to the end of the book of Genesis, and it even closes with his death. His life certainly is not over, but it has definitely peaked out in the previous two chapters, where we had an extensive treatment of Joseph's interaction with his brothers, and especially was it significant that they came and in fulfillment of the dreams that he had had when he was 17 years old, they actually did bow down the knee to him. And that was, of course, a fulfillment of prophetic dreams, though they had themselves determined that it would never happen. And we see the providence of God and the sovereignty of God in all of this. And that is perhaps one of the greatest lessons of the story of Joseph, which comes up again in the last chapter of Genesis. He makes mention of it. The sovereignty of God is a very important concept that we find throughout the book of Genesis. You know, each of the books of the Pentateuch, that is of the first 5 books of the Bible, has its own stress on some aspect of God's character or His dealings. Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, each has its own stress of what God does or who God is. And, for instance, in Exodus, it'll be very clear that the God as Redeemer is the portrayal that we get. In Genesis, clearly the main picture of God that we get throughout the book is God the sovereign. God who sovereignly creates and therefore is answerable to none, who makes His own rules because He makes everything, and who also sovereignly elects. Now, I certainly wouldn't want to get into all the controversy that rages over the matter of predestination and election, because I don't fall squarely into the camp either of the Calvinists or the Arminianists on this subject. I'm kind of, I believe the Scriptures lead us to something of a middle ground, but without entering into any controversy on the matter, it's very clear that the election of God as a sovereign act on His part is clear in the book of Genesis. Abraham, for instance, is selected out of all the population of the world, and apparently for no reason other than that God chose him, to be the one. Even before that, we see that Seth was the one selected to replace Abel, and it was his family line that gave rise to Noah, who is, of course, the one who was saved through the flood. And it seems like in each family God selected one, and sometimes He distinctly selected them even before they were born, as in the case of Jacob and Esau. God chose Jacob above Esau before either was born. Paul says in Romans 9, this He did in order that the election, that the call of God might stand on the basis of election rather than on the basis of works. And so we can see the divine sovereignty and election in this book. And His sovereignty is seen very, very clearly in the way that He manipulates history, even manipulates through the deeds of evil men, like Joseph's brothers, to bring about a salvation and a deliverance for His people in Egypt eventually. But of course this deliverance that came about by them going to Egypt also ended up in a future captivity. And the book of Genesis will close with Jacob and his sons in Egypt. And when you get to Exodus chapter 1 tomorrow, you'll find that by the time a few hundred years had passed, they had multiplied into a great multitude in Egypt, and in fact were a mighty nation to the extent that Pharaoh was threatened by them and brought them into captivity. That Pharaoh, however, in Exodus is a different Pharaoh than the Pharaoh who lived in Joseph's time. So we're reading about a time much earlier than that of Moses, several hundred years before Moses, a different Pharaoh who is favorable toward Joseph, of course, because Joseph saved the land of Egypt. In chapters 45 and following, we mainly have the mop-up of the story. We've kind of climaxed the story when Joseph revealed himself to his brothers in the previous chapter and sent word to his father, who for 20 years had thought Joseph was dead, and sent news to him that he was not only alive, but he was calling him to come and live in a place of security instead of in the famine smitten land of Canaan. But after that climax, we have what would definitely seem like an anticlimax, but an important anticlimax. We have mainly the migration of Jacob and his sons into Egypt in response to Joseph's call. And that is, of course, important because that explains how these people who we find in the beginning of Exodus, so numerous in the land of Egypt, how they got there and where they're from. As I said at the beginning, the book of Genesis is absolutely necessary as a foundation for all history and also as a foundation for all future or subsequent revelation. Because if we started the Bible without the book of Genesis, at Exodus, which would be a reasonable place to start, if we simply want to view the Old Testament as a history of the Jewish nation, the Jewish nation actually became a nation in Egypt. They grew from a little clan into a great nation, and their deliverance in the Exodus with Moses was the birth of a nation. The Bible could have started with Exodus, but it would have left us with many unanswered questions. And one of them, certainly not the least of them, would be, what's so significant about these people that we find in Egypt, in slavery? Why does God come to their aid? What's so special about them? How did they get there? Are they Egyptian or what? And the answer, of course, is given throughout the book of Genesis, going back to the call of Abraham, then his descendants at this point migrating to Egypt, where they became a great host. The closing chapters of Genesis also contain some significant transactions on the part of Jacob on his deathbed. One important transaction was that he adopted Joseph's two sons to be full heirs. We'll talk about the significance of that when we get there. But also, he gave specific blessings on each of his sons, as the patriarchs always did. And on his deathbed, he blessed each of the 12 sons. In many cases, if not all, the blessings he pronounced became prophecies that were fulfilled in the lives not of the sons themselves, but of their descendants. Each son gave rise to a whole tribe within Israel. And each tribe, its history followed generally the course that was predicted in the blessings. In chapter 45, it says, Then Joseph could not refrain himself. I'm sorry, we already read that chapter. I don't want to take any extra chapters. We don't have enough time as it is. I said we're starting at chapter 45. We're going to chapter 46. Chapter 46. And Israel took his journey with all that he had. Israel, of course, is Jacob. And came to Beersheba, and offered sacrifices unto the God of his father Isaac. And God spake unto Israel in the visions of the night, and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, Here am I. And he said, I am God, the God of thy father. Fear not to go down into Egypt, for I will there make of thee a great nation. I will go down with thee into Egypt, and I will also surely bring thee up again, and Joseph shall put his hand upon thine eyes. Now, this is the first time in many, many years that God revealed himself to Jacob, and it happens to be the last time also. Many years earlier, when Jacob had left Laban's home and come back into Bethel, God had spoken to him there at Bethel when Jacob went there to renew his vows. But since Bethel, and by this time some 20 years or more had passed since Bethel, since that time God had not revealed himself to Jacob. This is the final revelation, personal revelation of God to Jacob, and it was the first in a long time. You can see that there's a change happening in God's dealings because Abraham had periodical visits with God, where God would appear to him and speak to him. Isaac also had appearances of God, and so did Jacob in his earlier life, but as time went on, Jacob's sons sort of brought in a new era. God dealt personally with Abraham as an individual, and with Isaac as an individual, and with Jacob as an individual. But when Jacob had his 12 sons, suddenly he started dealing with the family, and not so much with the individual. And the more God's dealings began to deal with the clan, rather than with individual godly men, the more God phased out his personal visions and revelations, apparently. Now, I'm just saying that because that's the way the history reads. I'm not saying that I know the reason for that. But we see throughout the whole story of Joseph, we don't have any evidence that God personally revealed himself in a supernatural way, in a revelatory way to Joseph. Joseph had dreams, which were certainly revelations of his own destiny. But as far as seeing the Lord like his fathers had seen, or hearing God speak to him directly by revelation, we have no record of it in Joseph's life, nor certainly in his brothers' lives. But here we have the last time that God reveals himself and speaks plainly to Jacob. And the reason he does so, apparently, is because Jacob was now asked by Joseph to come into Egypt. Well, Jacob had never been in Egypt. But his father Isaac had started to go to Egypt once during a famine. And God had stopped him and said, don't go into Egypt. God had told Isaac, you stay here in Gerar. And that's, of course, where Isaac lied and said his wife Rebekah was his sister and so forth. But he lived peaceably on the outside of this Philistine city of Gerar for a while, because God had told him he could be safe there and not to go down into Egypt. Now that was God's instructions to Isaac. God had never spoken directly to Jacob not to go into Egypt, but perhaps that's because Jacob was never inclined to go to Egypt before this. And so here, perhaps Jacob would have to wonder, is this just a temptation to go down to Egypt? After all, there's famine here in Canaan. My grandfather Abraham went to Egypt in a famine in Canaan, and he ended up in compromise and got himself into trouble and risked Sarah's dignity. And of course, Isaac wanted to go to Egypt, and God told him specifically not to do it. So is it only a temptation from the enemy for me to go down there, or is this of God? He wasn't sure that just because there was an open door and a prosperous way made for him to go there, that it was necessarily God's purpose for his life. And we can't always judge God's purpose on the basis of the most attractive option that presents itself. And also the pressure of our present circumstances that would urge us to seek a better place. But rather, we have to get some kind of guidance from God. And so God revealed himself to Jacob and says, don't be afraid to go to Egypt. Go down there. In fact, that's the place that I'm going to make you into a great nation, or your children into a great nation. In fulfillment, of course, of the Abrahamic covenant. And Jacob rose up, verse 5, from Beersheba, and the sons of Israel carried Jacob their father and their little ones and their wives in their wagons which Pharaoh had sent to carry him. And they took their cattle and their goods, which they had gotten in the land of Canaan, and came into Egypt, Jacob and his seed with him, his sons and his sons' sons with him, his daughters and his sons' daughters, and all his seed brought he with him into the land of Egypt. Then it gives a genealogical table of basically his family. Now, in reading verses 8 through 27, I'd say, you would get the impression that this is the number of people. There are 70 named. This is the number of people that went down with Jacob into Egypt. However, it is not likely that that is what we have here. Rather than giving a biographical table, we're having a genealogical table here, which simply means that Moses, writing this some hundreds of years later, wanted to name all the families of the Jews that developed from Jacob, and some are mentioned here that were not alive yet when Jacob made this trip. For instance, there are 10 sons of Benjamin named here. Well, Benjamin couldn't be more than 22 or 3 years old at this time, and it's hardly likely he could have had 10 sons unless he had several, sets of quadruplets or something like that. But at age 22, for a man to have 10 sons is rather unlikely. But what we find is in the book of Numbers, there are the families of Israel named by their heads, and the same names that appear in this list appear in that list. And what we have here really is just a statement of what families of Israel grew out of this migration, rather than the exact names of the people who made the trip. Remember, Moses is writing this many hundreds of years later, and so he has access to information of how the family developed, who was born later, and so forth, and he includes them because, in a sense, even those unborn children did migrate with Jacob into Egypt. If we could say that Levi paid tithes to Melchizedek in Abraham, though Levi was not yet born, because Abraham paid tithes to Melchizedek, therefore in Abraham, Levi, who is still within Abraham, paid tithes, then we could easily say that these people, even who were not yet born, migrated to Egypt with Jacob and with his family. So it's fair enough to say that these people did migrate to Egypt, but they weren't all born yet when they did so. And we don't need necessarily to go through the names. It gives them by starting with the oldest son, Reuben, and goes on and gives his sons and in some cases grandsons of these men. But then at the end of it, in verse 27, it says, the sons of Joseph, which were born with him in Egypt, were 2 souls. Now see, in mentioning the sons of Joseph, they certainly didn't migrate to Egypt at this time. They were born in Egypt, and Joseph was too. So it's very clear that this list is not giving an exact list of the names who made the migration. Yes?
What about Acts 7:14?
It says 75 people made the trip. Acts 7:14 is, of course, Stephen's sermon. He gives a different total. He gives the total 75. This he does from quoting the Septuagint version. See, our Bible, the Old Testament, is translated from the Hebrew Masoretic text. In the days of the apostles, the prevalent version in use of the Old Testament was the Septuagint, which was a Greek translation made 285 years before Christ. And commonly, Paul and the apostles and Stephen obviously quote from the Septuagint. And the Septuagint gives a different listing of names. And so neither Stephen nor this is actually giving the number of people who actually made the trip. But rather, that is, many of them were not born yet when this trip was made, but they did make the trip in their fathers, that is to say. But the difference in Stephen's case, when he's telling that story, is that he includes obviously some other names that aren't listed in this genealogy. But there needn't be considered a contradiction, by the way. If the Septuagint disagreed from the Hebrew, we could blame it on the Septuagint translators, because we don't claim that the Septuagint translators were inspired. And when Stephen gave his sermon, quoting from the Septuagint, nowhere in the Bible does it say that he was speaking inerrantly. He was just speaking, and if he quoted from a Septuagint that had a wrong number in it, the book of Acts simply tells us that he quoted from the Septuagint. It doesn't tell us that the Septuagint was correct or that Stephen was correct. Right? We have many speeches in the Bible recorded of individuals who happen to be mistaken about things, but that doesn't mean that the scriptures themselves are wrong, only that they accurately record the speeches of men who could make mistakes. Anyway, the point here is that not everyone in the list actually made the trip personally. Some of them were born later. In verse 28 it says, "And he sent Judah before him into Joseph." Now Judah, remember, had shown himself truly the spiritual leader of the family. Judah was the third oldest, or the fourth oldest son. The three older sons were definitely spiritual inferiors to him, and it was Judah who had made himself surety for Benjamin, who had offered himself sacrificially to be taken as a slave instead of Benjamin. Judah really shined forth as the spiritual leader among the other 11 sons, and so Jacob sends Judah ahead, basically to honor him with leadership, unto Joseph, to direct his face unto Goshen. And they came into the land of Goshen. Now Goshen is a northern part of Egypt, and in those days it was actually inhabited by quite a few foreign peoples, not mainly by Egyptians. And most of the geographical names in Goshen are of Semitic origin rather than Egyptian origin. It's interesting because it was so un-Egyptian, but it was part of Egypt, technically speaking. And the reason they went to Goshen is, there's two reasons. One is it was the best part of Egypt for pasturing sheep, and that's, of course, what Jacob's family had, was sheep, hundreds, thousands of sheep. And there was sort of a beneficial cultural hang-up that the Egyptians had. The Bible says that shepherds are an abomination to the Egyptians. And so Jacob was told by Joseph to tell the Pharaoh, "We are shepherds," which was a true thing to say, but he knew that by saying that, he could ensure that he could get some separate property away from the Egyptians, because the Egyptians wouldn't want to associate with shepherds. And the idea was not only that they get the best pasture land in the country, which was Goshen, which was separate from the main population of Egypt. It was up to the north and away from the populated regions. But also, of course, to ensure a certain separateness from the culture of Egypt. This was a very important move for the children of Israel to make, because they came into Egypt clearly as sojourners. Their mentality was, we're coming here for a little while, basically till the famine ends. They ended up staying there 430 years. They didn't know they would. But they came in with the mind to sojourn, to temporarily stay, and that they hoped eventually to leave, so that they would not have the mind to intermix with the Egyptians. If they had not made this trip, if upon the death of Joseph and Jacob, the sons of Jacob and his grandsons were still in Canaan, which was the land that they were to inherit, they would not have a pilgrim's mentality. They would think this is our land. Therefore, they would be more settled in. They would have more tendency to intermix with the other settled residents of the land. They would not have the same separatist attitude toward where they were. So taking them down to Egypt would be clearly a way of separating them culturally. They'd have a separate area of Egypt away from most of the Egyptians. Because they were of a trade that the Egyptians despised as shepherds, they would ensure not very much intermixture that way. And also coming into Egypt, they would see themselves as sojourners, as temporary residents, and therefore, again, they would not tend to settle or build cities or be infiltrated by Egyptian culture. So this is no doubt the reason why God had them go to Egypt at this time. And they came to the land of Goshen, and Joseph made ready his chariot and went up to meet Israel his father to Goshen, and presented himself unto him, and he fell on his neck and wept on his neck a good while. Now remember, Joseph for 20 years had been a great monarch, revered by everyone in Egypt. Everyone bowed the knee and kissed the feet and proclaimed before the chariot of Joseph that he was the high ruler. None other than Pharaoh was above him in the land, and everyone bowed to Joseph. But when he came and saw his father again after this long separation, he was just the boy of 17 again, which is how old he was the last time he'd seen his father. And he just, he went all to pieces and fell and hugged his father and kissed his father and all. Just, you wouldn't know that he was this severe monarch that everyone else was so afraid of. And Israel said unto Joseph, Now let me die, since I have seen thy face, because thou art yet alive. That is, I'm fulfilled. I've had the ultimate joy of my life. There's no reason even for me to have to live on. And most people, to the day of their death, they're looking forward to the ultimate fulfillment, and they never find it. And on occasions there have been people, especially in the Bible that we read of, who on the moment that they feel like they've had the ultimate sense of joy and fulfillment and satisfaction, they say, well, there's nothing else to look forward to now. I mean, everything else will be anticlimactic after this. Remember Simeon in the temple when Jesus was brought there to be dedicated. Old Simeon took Jesus in his arms and said, Lord, let now your servant depart in peace, for mine eyes have seen thy salvation. Meaning, of course, I can die now, knowing that there's nothing more that I could possibly look forward to after this apex in my life. So, that's what Jacob said also. And Joseph said unto his brethren, and unto his father's house, I will go up and show Pharaoh, and say unto him, My brethren and my father's house, which were in the land of Canaan, are come unto me. And the men are shepherds, for their trade hath been to feed cattle, or livestock. And they have brought their flocks and their herds and all that they have. And it shall come to pass, when Pharaoh shall call you and say, What is your occupation? You shall say, Thy servant's trade hath been about livestock from our youth, even until now. Both we also and our fathers, and ye, that ye may dwell in the land of Goshen, for every shepherd is an abomination unto the Egyptians. So Joseph makes it very clear, when I bring you to Pharaoh, make sure you stress the fact that you're shepherds. This is very important, because I'm going to petition Pharaoh to give you the land of Goshen. And it's awfully nice land, and he might be reluctant until he finds out that you're shepherds and realizes that that's the best place for shepherds, and also that it's kind of separate, and since shepherds are an abomination to the Egyptians, that might also motivate the Pharaoh to put you off kind of away from everyone else. Chapter 47, Then Joseph came and told Pharaoh and said, My father and my brethren and their flocks and their herds and all that they have are come out of the land of Canaan, and behold, they are in the land of Goshen. And he took some of his brethren, even 5 men, and presented them unto Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said unto his brethren, What is your occupation? And they said unto Pharaoh, Thy servants are shepherds, both we and also our fathers. And they said moreover unto Pharaoh, For to sojourn in the land are we come. For thy servants have no pasture for their flocks, for the famine is sore in the land of Canaan. Now therefore we pray thee, let thy servants dwell in the land of Goshen. And Pharaoh spake unto Joseph, saying, Thy father and thy brethren are come unto thee, the land of Egypt is before thee. In the best of the land make thy father and brethren to dwell. In the land of Goshen let them dwell. And if thou knowest any men of activity among them, then let them be rulers over my cattle also. And Joseph brought in Jacob his father, and set him before Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh, and Pharaoh said unto Jacob, How old are you? And Jacob said, he must have looked awfully old. That's a strange thing to ask a man when you meet him. But Jacob said unto Pharaoh, The days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have the days of the years of my life been, and have not attained unto the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh, and went out from before Pharaoh. Let's talk about that passage. When the 5 brothers of Jacob were taken in to meet Pharaoh, he inquired, as we see, about their occupation, and they answered according to the words that Joseph told them to answer. And surely the designed intention was fulfilled, that he did give them the land of Goshen to live in. Notice that when they came in verse 4, they said, We have come to sojourn in the land. Now, that's very important. They didn't come to immigrate and to change citizenship, and yet, perhaps given the type of circumstances, they might have sought to do so. Egypt in general was a lot nicer place to live than Canaan in some respects. First of all, it was not hit by famines anywhere near as much as the neighboring regions were, because the Nile River would hardly ever dry up, and therefore it was always watered, even in times of drought. And Egypt was, of course, the most powerful country in the world, so there'd be a sense of political and military security living in that country instead of being one of these roaming tribal groups in Canaan that were always at war with each other and always, involved in bloody conflicts. There'd also be just the general culture and status of living in Egypt that would be attractive. And with Joseph in the position he was in politically in Egypt, it would have been a simple matter for the men to immigrate and to become Egyptian citizens and have all the benefits. But they wanted to make it very clear. They were coming into sojourn. That means they were visitors. They didn't want to come permanently. And that, of course, meant that they would be free to leave whenever they wanted to. If they said, we're coming to immigrate, we'd like to be naturalized citizens here, then, of course, they wouldn't be free to give up their citizenship without Pharaoh's permission. Once they became his citizens, they'd come under his rulership, and they'd therefore have to get permission from him to leave. But coming in avowedly with only a visitor's visa, in order to just be sojourners temporarily, it was clear that since they're only visiting, they can leave when they want to. Now, that, of course, was the agreement with which they entered the land of Egypt. But you remember that some centuries later, when they decided it was time for them to leave, the new Pharaoh wouldn't let them go. And that's why God had to send 10 plagues and part the Red Sea and the whole thing. Because the later Pharaoh did not acknowledge the validity of their original terms of coming in. Of course, they did stay a rather long time, and they probably were not forced to stay the first few hundred years, the first few generations, because the Pharaoh that put them in bondage was a Pharaoh that rose up who didn't know Joseph. So that must have been a few generations, I'd think, after Joseph's time. Bruce?
Well, a lot of countries and a lot of states, even the United States today, have a law. It's really interesting point about this one. It's based on intent.
Mm-hmm.
If you move into a state and you're intending to stay there, that's your intent, then you fall under all the civil laws of that state.
It's very different than if you're just passing through.
Yeah, if you're visiting or even a tourist, you don't.
Right.
So it's kind of that's a different thing.
Right, and that's obviously why they stressed that they were sojourning, so that they would have a certain autonomy and ability to say, well, we're leaving, and not have to give any reasons for it, and not have to get anyone's permission. Of course, it didn't work out that way, but this just shows the further or the greater injustice of the later Pharaoh, who refused to let them go, since they were never his citizens and never asked to be. But he brought them forcibly under his rule. Then, of course, Jacob himself was brought in, and the Pharaoh asked how old he was, and it might seem strange to us that Jacob would say, well, I haven't lived very long, only 130 years. It was clear that he was an old man, even by those days' standards, because the Pharaoh, why would he ask how old he was, unless he, obviously, the answer was going to be impressive, And anyway, he said, 130 years, few and evil have been my days of my pilgrimage, meaning his lifetime. He meant compared to his fathers. Isaac, his father, lived 180 years. Abraham, his grandfather, lived 175 years. He had only lived 130 years, and he anticipated his death was near. In fact, he lived another 17 years after this, but he didn't know he was going to, and he thought he'd really only had a short life. He did say his days were not only few compared to his father's, but evil, meaning, of course, that he'd had a lot more trials than his fathers had. I would say that Abram and Isaac certainly had their trials. But we would have to agree that the life of Jacob, especially after he fled from Esau to Paddan Aram and lived with Laban, from that time on, it was one trial after another. And he definitely had a harder pilgrimage in that sense than his fathers had had. So that would explain why he'd say his days have been few and evil compared to those of his father. Now, he blessed Pharaoh, which kind of shows a beginning of the fulfillment of the original Abrahamic promise, that in him and in his seed all the nations of the earth would be blessed. Well, already there had been a very practical blessing bestowed upon the Egyptians by the very presence of Joseph, and his wise administration through the famine saved the whole land of Egypt and all the neighboring lands too, because they would come and buy food from Egypt when they were out of money. So, or out of food, I should say. So in a sense, in Joseph, practically speaking, the nations of the world were beginning to be blessed, even as it had been promised to Abraham. And here, in a more perhaps spiritual sense, we find Jacob or Israel pronouncing a blessing which would have to be probably more of a spiritual kind of blessing, though we don't know the nature of the blessing. When he blessed his own children, we actually have record of what he said and what the blessing was that he pronounced, but we only have a general statement. He blessed Pharaoh, and that must have been something along the lines of calling for God's favor on the man. And, of course, the blessing of the seed of Abraham, who is Christ, to all nations is twofold. There is a natural blessing that comes on the world, just like the natural blessing that came on Egypt through Joseph. Even those who don't receive the gospel have been blessed by the presence of the church. I mean, hospitals, orphanages, other institutions that have blessed society in general have been founded and pioneered by the church. And the fact that the church has influenced, in the Western world particularly, the making of laws and such for just causes, and have raised the standard of respect for women and for children and has fairly abolished slavery and done a lot of other things, shows that through Abraham's seed, that is through Christ and through the church, all nations of the world that have any contact with him have been blessed in a very natural sense, just like Egypt and other nations were in that way blessed by Joseph's presence. But in the other sense, of course, those who receive Christ receive even more of a blessing. They not only have the cultural benefits that the church, like leaven in a lump of dough, have brought into society, but they have the spiritual benefit of the favor of God come upon them. And Jacob blessing Pharaoh pictures for us that other aspect of blessing the nations, that in calling down a favor from God upon this man who is a Gentile, we see prefigured the fact that Abram's seed, his greater seed, Christ, would bring a spiritual blessing of favor, or, of course, the word grace, charis in the Greek, means favor, literally. That's what the word grace literally means, is favor. And the grace that has come to the Gentiles is sort of a antitype of this typical story of Jacob blessing Pharaoh. And Joseph placed his father and his brethren and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land in the land of Rameses. Now, Rameses is the same region as Goshen. Rameses was a major city in the land of Goshen, and sometimes because of the city being there, the land was called the land of Rameses. It ended up being one of the cities that the Jews, when made slaves, built for Pharaoh. There were two cities in particular named in Exodus chapter 1 that were built by the Jews when they were slaves of Pharaoh. They were Rameses and Pithom. And so that's the region that they went to live in. And when the migration from Egypt began with Moses, it seems to have begun from Rameses. Their pilgrimage out of Egypt seems to have started there. So they must have remained even throughout the whole time there. We remember when the plagues came on the Egyptians in the days of Moses, just before the Exodus, that the land of Goshen, where the Jews were, was exempted from many of the plagues, whereas the rest of Egypt was hit pretty hard. So, they stayed in the land of Rameses, and Joseph nourished his father and his brethren and all his father's household with bread according to their families. And there was no bread in all the land, for the famine was very sore, so that the land of Egypt and all the land of Canaan fainted by reason of the famine. And Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan for the corn which they bought. Now, it goes on in the next several verses to describe how the people ran out of money. And so they came to Joseph and said, how about we give you our land for food, since it's better for us to better for us to live without land than to die and own it. So actually, when they ran out of money, they began to sell their land off to the government. So you remember, Joseph acted as the agent of the government at Pharaoh, so that all the land, it says, actually eventually became Pharaoh's. And it says in verse 20 that Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for the Egyptians sold every man his field because of the famine prevailed over them, so the land became Pharaoh's. And as for the people, he removed them to the cities from one end of the borders of Egypt to the other end thereof. Now, it says only the land of the priests. Now, this, of course, would not be God's priests. This would be the Egyptian priests. He didn't buy because they had an assigned lot. That is, their food was a government subsidy, and therefore they didn't have to sell whatever land they had because they weren't hungry like everyone else was. They had food provided by the government. And in verse 23, it shows that Joseph, even though he was what we call an absolute monarch, I mean, he was in the position to do anything he wanted to He had these people at his mercy. They were bowing down, begging him to take their lands. I mean, how often can the government take people's lands from them at the people's request and have the people bless them for doing so? You know, here all the land is becoming state property. It's all belonging to Pharaoh. And the people are blessed to have it so, just because they'll die otherwise. They're glad that he'll take the land from them in exchange for food. But Joseph, though he had the people at his mercy like this, and could have really abused them if he'd been such a ruler as history has produced most of the time when they have that kind of power, yet he was merciful, and what he did, he actually gave them the land back to work it. As stewards of the land, though it was Pharaoh's land now, they were able to work the land and keep it and simply pay a levy of what was produced on it, a percentage, which means that even if there were crop failures, they wouldn't stand to lose anything by it because they weren't obligated to pay any particular amount, only a percentage. And since their food was being supplied to them by the government, it was really a godsend to the people, really, to have this kind of arrangement, because their land was unable to produce food during the famine anyway. So all he required was that they levy a percentage of whatever it did produce and give it to Pharaoh in exchange for the use of it. So he was very mercifully took care of things. Verse 23 says, Joseph said unto the people, Behold, I have bought you this day and your land for Pharaoh. That is, they sold their bodies. Also, after the land became Pharaoh's, they sold themselves as slaves to Pharaoh. So they were really, Pharaoh owned it all. It says, Behold, I have bought you this day and your land for Pharaoh. Lo, here is seed for you, and ye shall sow in the land. And it shall come to pass in the increase that you shall give a fifth part, 20%, unto Pharaoh, and 4 parts shall be your own, for seed of the field, and for your food, and for them of your household, and for food for your little ones. And they said, Thou hast saved our lives. Let us find grace in the sight of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's servants. So they were blessed to be slaves, and blessed to own no land. They said, it's for our lives, you know. And Joseph made it a law over the land of Egypt unto this day. And Moses, writing this hundreds of years later, when he says unto this day, means that the law that Joseph made remained enacted for several generations afterwards. And Moses, of course, would be well aware of the laws of the Egyptians, having been trained. He learned all the wisdom of the Egyptians. He certainly would have had a legal training in the house of Pharaoh, since he was raised as a son of Pharaoh's daughter. So when Moses says it remains a law in Egypt to this day, you know it's coming from one who can speak authoritatively and is very much aware of the laws, the contemporary laws of Egypt at the time he's writing. Joseph made it a law in the land of Egypt unto this day that Pharaoh should have the fifth part, except the land of the priests only, which became not Pharaoh's. And Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt, in the country of Goshen, and they had possessions therein, and grew and multiplied exceedingly. Now notice, they were nourished by Joseph. They didn't have to sell lands. Of course, they didn't own any land. They were just given the use of land of Goshen. But one thing they were exempt from that other Egyptians fell under, they didn't have to sell themselves to Pharaoh. The Egyptians sold their lands and then themselves as slaves to Pharaoh to survive. So that all the Egyptians literally were the slaves of Pharaoh, but Israel was not. Israel didn't have to sell themselves to Pharaoh. It was later, as an act of oppression, that a later Pharaoh forcibly made them slaves, but he had no right to make them slaves. His own people he had the right to order around because they had sold themselves into slavery, and their children and their children's children would rightfully be his slaves as well. But the children of Israel were not rightfully his slaves. They never sold themselves, and therefore it was strictly an act of wrongful oppression that he later made them slaves. And of course it says they had possessions therein, and they grew and multiplied exceedingly. Verse 28, And Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 more years. So the whole age of Jacob was 147 years, and the time drew nigh that Israel must die, and he called his son Joseph, and said unto him, If now I have found grace in thy sight, put, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh. Again, a means of swearing an oath. Remember that Abraham had asked his servant Eliezer to put his hand under his thigh when he was causing him to swear an oath that he would not take Isaac back into the land of, or that he would not let Isaac marry a Canaanite or take him back into the land of Haran. And so here we have Jacob following the same procedure. Joseph is certainly the man to ask this request of, since he's in the position to see it carried out. He says, put your hand under my thigh. And he says, if now I have found grace in thy sight, put, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh, and deal kindly and truly with me. Bury me not, I pray thee, in Egypt. But I will lie with my fathers, and thou shalt carry me out of Egypt, and bury me in their burying place. And he said, I will do as thou hast said. And Jacob said, swear unto me. And he swore unto him, and Israel bowed himself upon the bed's head. Now, this actually was an act of real faith on Jacob's part. Because 17 years, although it passes over in one verse here in the narrative, really is a period of time that seems relatively lengthy when you're really living through it. And having spent 17 years in the lushness and pleasures and prosperity of Egypt, and with every indication that things would continue to go well for the family, because in Joseph's death, presumably his sons would come to high positions in Egypt, and his sons' sons, it would seem like Egypt was a good place for the family to stay. But Jacob had the promise of God, which he had his faith in, that this was not to be their land, but that they had a land in Canaan. Now, remember, God had promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that they would own the land of Canaan, but they hardly owned any of it. The only part Abraham ever owned in his lifetime was a little cave that he bought to bury his dead in. And the only part Jacob ever owned was a field that he bought from the sons of Heth, and it's just a little piece of property that he built some booths and a house on. And so you can see that there really wasn't, or it's just outside Shechem, you remember, Sychar, by the way, that's where the well is that Jesus sat and talked to the woman at the well at. It's Sychar, the piece of property that Jacob purchased from the Hittites. But they owned very little of Canaan. They didn't really own much of it, even though the whole land was promised them. And 3 generations of Jews, or of Abraham's seed, I should say, had lived in Canaan without ever taking possession of it, without ever seeing the promises fulfilled. And now they're in Egypt. It almost seems like they're in a position to take over Egypt. It seems almost like they'd be wiser to cast their lot into controlling Egypt rather than trying to take over Canaan. They'd never gotten much success in Canaan, but here they are in Egypt, treated like kings. And yet, Jacob believes the promise of God that Egypt is not to be the place for them, but Canaan is, despite appearances. And therefore he says, make sure you don't bury me here in Egypt. I want to be buried in Canaan, because that's where our family is eventually going to live. And he asked to be buried in Machpelah, the cave where Abraham and Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, and Leah were buried. And so, in chapter 48, it came to pass after these things that one told Joseph, behold, your father is sick. And he took with him his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, Joseph's sons. And one told Jacob and said, behold, thy son Joseph cometh unto thee. And Israel strengthened himself and sat upon his bed. And Jacob said unto Joseph, God Almighty, that's El Shaddai in the Hebrew, appeared unto me at Luz, which also is Bethel, in the land of Canaan, and blessed me, and said unto me, behold, I will make thee fruitful, and multiply thee, and I will make of thee a multitude of people, and will give this land to thy seed after thee for an everlasting possession. And now, thy 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, which were born unto thee in the land of Egypt before I came unto thee into Egypt, are mine. As Reuben and Simeon they shall be mine. Now this is very significant. Reuben and Simeon were the 2 oldest sons of Jacob by Leah, Reuben and Simeon. In other words, they would be the men who would be the natural heirs. They were the 2 sons who would have the first claim, you'd think, on the birthright. But now he says Ephraim and Manasseh, interestingly naming the younger before the older, which is significant later too. Manasseh was the older son of Joseph and Ephraim the younger, but he said Ephraim and Manasseh, reversing the birth order. So they shall be my sons just like Reuben and Simeon are. Now what this means is that the sons of Joseph would not have the status of being Jacob's grandsons, but of being his sons. And the reason that's important is because in the dividing of the inheritance and the dividing of the land of Canaan eventually, each son or each tribe that arose from a son would get a portion. And ordinarily Joseph would get 1 portion and each of his other 11 brothers would get 1 portion. But by elevating Joseph's 2 sons to full sonship of Jacob, each of them would get a portion. So that as it turned out, Joseph got 2 portions. 1 for Manasseh and 1 for Ephraim. Now, remember, Joseph's brothers also had sons, but none of their sons were elevated to the status of sonship to Jacob. Their sons were just grandsons and had to divide up whatever their fathers got. But in elevating Manasseh and Ephraim to full sonship, Jacob was effectively giving the birthright to Joseph. And that's what he wanted to do. Now, the spiritual birthright, as far as being able to be the ruler and give rise to the Messiah, fell to Judah. And we'll talk about that in the next chapter. But Joseph is the one that got the natural birthright of the double portion, because a man's birthright ordinarily was just that, a double portion of his inheritance. And let's see, in 1 Chronicles, there's a reference to this. I'd like for you to turn there if you would. 1 Chronicles chapter 5. First Chronicles 5, verses 1 and 2, it says, "Now the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, for he was the firstborn, for as much as he defiled his father's bed, his birthright was given unto the sons of Joseph, the son of Israel. And the genealogy is not to be reckoned after the birthright, that is, Reuben's is not. For Judah prevailed above his brethren, and of him came the chief ruler, but the birthright was Joseph's." So, a later writer in Chronicles says that Judah prevailed above his brethren and became the father of the chief ruler. That would be David and his descendants, and Messiah eventually. But the birthright, that is the natural birthright of a double portion, was Joseph's. And so that's what we have happening in chapter 48. Officially, it would be difficult for Jacob to justify giving Joseph the birthright, since there was another son several other sons older than him that you'd think it would fall to. So the way that Jacob gets around it is simply by adopting Joseph's sons. And so that without specifically and officially giving Joseph the birthright, Joseph gets it anyway, because the double portion would have to fall into his family, because each of his sons gets a full portion that way. So that's what's happening. But that's not all he does here. In verse 6, back in Genesis 48:6, it says, "And thy issue which thou begettest after them shall be thine." That is to say, if Joseph has any other children, they won't be full sons of Jacob. Only these two are. And you can have whatever other sons you have to be your sons, he said. "And they shall be called after the name of their brethren in their inheritance. And as for me, when I came from Paddan Aram, that's Laban's home, Rachel died by me in the land of Canaan in the way, when yet there was but a little way to come unto Ephrath, which is Bethlehem. And I buried her there in the way of Ephrath, which the same as Bethlehem. And Israel beheld Joseph's sons, and said, Who are these? And Joseph said unto his father, They are my sons, whom God hath given me in this place. And he said, Bring them, I pray thee, unto me, and I will bless them. Now the eyes of Israel were dim for age, so that he could not see. Just like Isaac, when he was blessing his sons, he was blind. So Jacob now was also blind with age, and is blessing these two sons. And he brought them near to him, and he kissed them and embraced them. And Israel said to Joseph, I had not thought to see thy face, and lo, God hath showed me also thy seed. And Joseph brought them out from between his knees, and he bowed himself with his face to the earth. And Joseph took them both, Ephraim in his right hand toward Israel's left hand, and Manasseh in his left hand toward Israel's right hand, and brought them near unto him. Now, it specifically said that Manasseh was placed by Israel's right hand, and Ephraim by Israel's left hand, because Manasseh was the older one, and therefore should get the right hand. The blessing from, if he was going to bless both of them, the right hand would be the preferred hand. To be the son of the right hand, or to sit at the right hand of a ruler, suggested being, in a place of prominence. The right hand was a place of favor. So since Manasseh was older, Joseph positioned the two boys so that naturally Israel's hand the right hand, which is this one, would go on to the older son. So he'd get the preferred blessing. However, it says, in verse 14, And Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it upon Ephraim's head, who was the younger, and his left hand upon Manasseh's head, guiding his hands knowingly, for Manasseh was the firstborn. Now, in others, he crossed his hands so that his right hand went on to the younger son, Ephraim. And he blessed Joseph and said, God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac did walk, the God which fed me all my life long unto this day, the angel which redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads, and let my name be named on them, and the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth. And when Joseph saw that his father had laid his right hand upon the head of Ephraim, it displeased him, and he held up his father's hand to remove it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. And Joseph said unto his father, Not so, my father, for this is the firstborn, but put thy right hand upon his head. And his father refused and said, I know it, my son, I know it. He also shall become a people, and he also shall be great, but truly this younger brother shall be greater than he, and his seed shall become a multitude of nations. Now, whether this blessing was simply speaking of prophecy, or whether it indicated Jacob's preference, we don't know. Jacob, you remember, had himself been the younger son and had received the blessing from his father over against the older son. And maybe there's something about his personal history that inclined him to want to give the blessing to the younger of the two sons also. Whether it had anything to do with just strictly speaking of prophecy that he uttered, or whether he desired to give the blessing to the younger son, and that was a preferential treatment just coming out of his own heart, we don't know. But in any case, his words were proved to be true in later history. And the remarkable thing is they weren't proved to be true in the lifetime of Moses, who wrote this. That is to say, Moses did not write this as a fabrication to try to explain a phenomenon that existed in his days hundreds of years later. Because in Moses' days, Manasseh was still a larger tribe than Ephraim. Manasseh, in the book of Numbers, which is when the numbering of the 12 tribes took place in the lifetime of Moses, the tribe of Manasseh had 20,000 more people than Ephraim had. So that you can see that in writing this, Moses was not describing something that was fulfilled even in his own time. It still was an unfulfilled prophecy at the time it was written down. But in later Jewish history, especially in the time of the Judges, this was quite fulfilled, and Ephraim became the leading tribe of the northern 10. Manasseh became a much less significant tribe. In fact, eventually, they ended up on the east side of Jordan because they chose a possession outside the Promised Land. And when the nation divided into two kingdoms, I don't know if you're familiar with that subsequent history of Israel well enough or not, but in the days of Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, the nation of Israel divided into two kingdoms, the northern and the southern. The southern kingdom was comprised only of two tribes, Judah and Benjamin. The northern kingdom was comprised of 10 tribes, and the largest, most powerful, was Ephraim. So much so that just as the southern kingdom, which was made up of two tribes, was called Judah, because that kingdom was made up of two tribes, Benjamin and Judah was by far the most powerful of the two, so the kingdom was simply called Judah. The northern kingdom of Israel was sometimes called Ephraim in the prophets. You will find many times, in Hosea particularly, and in other prophets also, that the name Ephraim is substituted for the northern kingdom. Even though Ephraim was just one of the 10 tribes, it was by far the most powerful and the most influential of the 10 tribes. So, except for Judah, the tribe of Ephraim became the largest and the most powerful tribe in Israel, and this in fulfillment of this prophecy. Though, as I said, it didn't happen in the lifetime of Moses, and that he wrote this down at a time when things did not appear to be that way. Just shows that Moses was writing truthfully, and that this was uttered prophetically, and that it's not, as some people try to late date prophecies and try to say, well, a prophecy was written after its fulfillment, and that explains why it was so accurate. But obviously, this was not written after its fulfillment. It was written and uttered before the fulfillment, and yet came quite true. Verse 20, And he blessed them that day, saying, In thee shall Israel bless, saying, God make thee as Ephraim and Manasseh. And he set Ephraim before Manasseh. That is, if people want to bless you, they won't say, God make you like Manasseh and Ephraim, putting them in their birth order, but they'll say like Ephraim and Manasseh, giving Ephraim the preeminence. And Israel said unto Joseph, Behold, I die, but God shall be with you, and bring you again unto the land of your fathers. Moreover, I have given to thee one portion above thy brethren, which I took out of the hand of the Amorite with my sword and my bow. Now this portion, all scholars agree, is the portion that he purchased from Hamor, or from the sons of Hamor outside Shechem, that we mentioned earlier. He bought that one piece of property outside the city of Shechem. And that's where Sychar is, the well that Jesus talked to the woman at the well. That's the piece of property he's talking about. Yet here, he doesn't mention having bought it. He mentions taking it forcibly from the Amorites or from the Canaanites with his sword and with his bow. Now, he didn't do that. And that seems a bit awkward since he bought it peaceably with money. Then he said he took it with his sword and his bow. But I believe what we have here is a prophecy. And many times prophecies, as we will see, we'll discuss this at length when we get to the prophetic books, but a very common feature of the prophetic books is that they are written in what is sometimes called the prophetic perfect tense. That is, things that the prophet is foreseen are written as though they're already fulfilled. He'll look at the end of the world and say, the land it lies desolate. Everyone's, wiped out and so forth. He's describing it as though it's already happened, but he's really looking forward to something that hasn't happened. A typical example is Isaiah 53, which describes the crucifixion of Jesus, written 800 years before Jesus lived on earth, yet it speaks about it in the past tense. He was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities and so forth, as though it already happened. But in Isaiah's day it hadn't happened, but he's using what is called the prophetic perfect tense. That is, what God has decreed is so certain, even though it has not occurred in history, it is so certain because of the decree of God that it can be spoken of as though it has happened. God speaks those things which are not as though they were. He called Abraham the father of a multitude as though he were, though he wasn't yet. And so many times a prophetic statement will be written or spoken in a sort of a past tense. And what I believe this is doing is looking forward to the fact that this piece of property that Jacob purchased peaceably will eventually have to be bought back or won back from the Amorites with the sword and the bow, of course, in the days of Joshua, when the Jews would return from Egypt and go into the Promised Land and win it back by war. And so I believe that that's prophetically looking forward to the warfare that would be required for him to get back that which he had rightfully purchased. Now, going on to chapter 49, this chapter probably has more to comment upon than any of the other chapters we're talking about today, and yet we don't have that much time left. I will try to do it some justice, but this chapter is primarily made up of blessings that were pronounced by Jacob on his deathbed over his 12 sons. He's already blessed Ephraim and Manasseh separately, but now he calls all 12 of his sons on because he knows he's going to die. And starting with the oldest and working down to the youngest, he pronounces a blessing on each of them. Now, in blessing them, he prophesies something about them in most cases. Many of these prophecies, it is impossible to know how they were fulfilled. For one reason, many of them, it's impossible to know what they mean. Sometimes there's only a brief sentence uttered over a person, and the language is so poetic and so figurative that it could be interpreted a number of ways, and having only limited written history in the Old Testament about what happened to some of these tribes, we just are not able to compare Scripture with Scripture in every case to show how these utterances were good or how they were fulfilled. In some cases we can. But I must say we're not going to reach complete satisfaction, though we could wish to, in understanding what each of these utterances meant and how it came to be fulfilled in history. In some cases, and we'll dwell on these only, we can see what they mean and how they were fulfilled. An example of one that we don't quite know how to understand it would be like Issachar in verse 14. Is a strong ass crouching down between two burdens. He saw that rest was good, and the land that it was pleasant, and bowed down his shoulder to bear, and he became servant under tribute. There's not any one occurrence in the history of Issachar that is known to us that fulfilled this. In some respects, the prophecies uttered over a particular tribe can be sort of a general statement of how their whole history was without making reference to any specific thing. But there are some very specific things in some of them that are predicted, and we'll talk about those ones only. In chapter 49, verse 1, it says, Jacob called unto his sons and said, Gather yourselves together, that I may tell you that which shall befall you in the last days. Now, don't be confused about this expression, the last days. We know that a lot of times we think of the last days as just before Jesus comes back, and on the basis of that, some people have felt maybe these are prophecies that will be fulfilled to the 12 tribes in the last days. The only trouble is, if we're talking about future fulfillment as of future to us, it's almost impossible to know how these could possibly be fulfilled to individual tribes, since the individuality of the tribes has been lost since 70 AD. When the temple was destroyed, all the family genealogies were wiped out, burned up with the temple. The archives were destroyed, and since that time, Jews do not know and cannot know what tribe they are of, with the possible exception of a few tribes that bear family names or individuals like Levi or Levi or Cohen. The name Cohen, which is a common Jewish name, actually means priest. And certain names obviously speak of a Levitical background, though whether or not marriage has remained within the tribe for the past 2,000 years is impossible to tell. And so I would say that any belief that sometime in the yet future there will be prophecies fulfilled on individual tribes, I believe it's very difficult to imagine that, since there's not really any distinction between the tribes of Israel anymore since 70 AD or since a few generations after that. Only in a few cases could a Jew know what tribe his ancestors were from, and even then he could only know his father's side of the family because of his father's name. He would never know what his mother's side of the family was unless, over this millennia, there's been so much intermarriage and so much loss of tribal identity that to think that there's going to be specific tribes singled out in the last days, you'd need the Urim and the Thummim to determine, who's of what tribe. And I don't think they're going to find that. Joseph Smith already hit it. But the last days simply means latter days, or days after his time. Many of these were fulfilled in Old Testament history. And we wouldn't call that the last days ourselves, but that's a valid use of the language, because many prophecies in the Bible are said to be either of the last days or the latter days, and they were fulfilled in what we would now call history. Much in the New Testament speaks of the last days as being present 2,000 years ago. Hebrews chapter 1 says, God, who at sundry times and divers manners spake in times past unto our fathers by the prophets, hath in these last days spoken unto us by his Son. So Hebrews 1:1 indicates that the writer was living in these last days. Well, that's 2,000 years ago. It says in 1 John, in chapter 2, as you've heard that Antichrist shall come. He said, little children, it is the last day. It is the final days, the latter days. And as you've heard that Antichrist shall come, even now are there many Antichrists whereby we know that it is the last time. So even though 2,000 years ago he wrote it, he said it was the last time. We can't dispute it. The fact is that it clearly shows that last days does not necessarily mean the few days or years before Jesus returns. Anyway, these are things that will be fulfilled later in their history. That's all we get from that. And it says, gather yourselves together and hear, ye sons of Jacob, and hearken unto Israel your father. Some of these sons get very brief mention, some of them more lengthy. The longest blessing is pronounced upon Joseph, and the second longest is on Judah. Reuben, the firstborn, it says, Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, and the beginning of my strength, the excellency of dignity and the excellency of power. That is what he should have been. As firstborn, the son of his strength, the son of his youthfulness, although he wasn't extremely youthful when he began having children, but he was the youngest when he bore Reuben than when he bore when he had any other children. He says, as my firstborn, you should have been, is essentially what he's saying. The excellency of dignity. You should have had great power and dignity in the family. However, he says, what you really are, in verse 4, is unstable as water. You shall not excel, because you went up to thy father's bed, then defiledst thou it. He went up to my couch. Now that was reference to the fact that he went into Bilhah, his father's concubine, in an earlier chapter, and it simply says at that time that Jacob knew of it, but it doesn't say that Jacob did anything about it. And now, many decades later, it comes back to roost with Reuben, that though he seemed to have gotten away with his sin, nonetheless he's stuck with the consequences of it forever. He loses his birthright. Now, when he says, you shall not excel, we have some other references in Scripture that sort of indicate how that was fulfilled. One of them is in Numbers chapter 32, where we find that the leaders of the tribe of Reuben, along with those of Gad and Manasseh, came to Moses and asked special permission not to live in the promised land, because the land in Transjordan was lush and good for pasturing their flocks, and they were granted permission by Moses that if they would go in and help their brethren conquer the land of Canaan, then when the conquest was complete, they could return to the east side of Jordan and lived there. And so they did. So the tribe of Reuben did not have a possession in the land of Canaan, as it turned out. And so they didn't prosper. They didn't excel in the land. They didn't even live in the promised land. In Deuteronomy 33, I might mention, just as we turn here, that besides Genesis 49, there are two other passages in the Old Testament where blessings are pronounced on each of the tribes. One is Deuteronomy 33, where Moses, at the end of his life, speaks of blessing on each of the tribes. In some cases, there's similarities between what he said and what Jacob said. In other cases, there's no connection. And a third passage of this sort is in the 23rd and 24th chapters, I think it is, of Numbers. I think maybe it's chapter 24 of Numbers, where Balaam is prophesying, and he speaks about the various tribes of Israel and prophesies about them. And so we have some interesting parallels, for instance, between Genesis 49, where Jacob blesses his sons, and Deuteronomy 33, where Moses blesses the tribes hundreds of years later, and then Numbers, I think it's Numbers 24, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, and that's where Balaam does similarly. Anyway, in Deuteronomy 33, concerning Reuben, it says in verse 6, "Let Reuben live and not die, and let not his men be few." Now, if you have the King James Version, it says, "Let not his men be few," but "not" is in italics, which means it's not in the original. And therefore, what he really said is, "Let his men be few." Now, why the translators stuck the word "not" in there, I don't know. I guess they figured it wouldn't be much of a blessing to say, "Let his men be few," so they thought maybe what he meant was, "Don't let his men be few." But the actual reading should be, "Let Reuben live and not die, but let his men be few." He would not have a large portion in the land. And so he did not excel. When it says he went into his father's bed, we're back into Genesis again, 49:4. He says the reason he would not excel is because of his instability, his moral weakness, tossed to and fro by temptation, and he could not stand. He was not morally, or he didn't have strong character. Therefore, he couldn't become a leader, spiritual leader. And it is evidenced by the fact that he succumbed to this sensual temptation with Bilhah, if that's what it was, and he brought a curse upon himself instead of a blessing. In Deuteronomy 27:20, there are a number of curses that Moses had the people repeat after him that would come upon anybody who did certain things that are named in these curses. And it's Deuteronomy 27. And in verse 20 he says, "Cursed be he that lieth with his father's wife, because he uncovereth his father's skirt." And all the people shall say, "Amen." Actually, each verse in this latter part of this chapter, Moses says, "Cursed be someone," and tells some great sin, and then the people say, "Amen." That is accepting the fact that such a person deserves to be cursed. Here the man who sleeps with his father's wife, as Reuben did, is pronounced cursed. Next we have Simeon and then Levi, and they're taken together. They're partners in crime. They both wiped out the inhabitants of Shechem against their father's wishes and against common decency. And therefore, instead of giving them each a separate blessing, they are treated as though they are one. In fact, he says Simeon and Levi are brethren. Not only brethren in the sense that they both have the same father and mother, which they did, but also companions in sin. And it says, "Instruments of cruelty are in their habitations. O my soul, come not thou into their secret." That is, I don't want to be taken into their conspiracy. My soul, stay clear of these men. "Unto their assembly mine honor, be not thou united. For in their anger they slew a man, and in their self-will they digged down a wall." Now, dig down a wall is a strange translation, because almost all the newer translations agree that instead of dig down a wall, it should be they hamstrung oxen, which is something that was done out of spite, usually, when a marauding tribe would come in and wipe out the population of a city. They would not only kill the people, they'd also cripple the livestock by cutting the hamstring on the back, the tendon on the back of the heel of, or what would be the heel of oxen. They usually would do it to horses, because of course horses represent military power, and to hamstring the horses was to cripple all the horses so that you'd not only wipe out the population, but just destroy their military strength. But these guys, just out of spite, not only wiped out the people of Shechem, but apparently they hamstrung the oxen also, which was just a way of showing their fierce anger. And it says, "Cursed be their anger, for it was fierce, and their wrath, for it was cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel." How this was fulfilled, it's very interesting how it was fulfilled, because Simeon and Levi, in fact, were scattered in Israel. Now notice that's in contrast to the fact that they were united in crime. They were united in crime, but as a judgment they would be scattered from each other and within their group. You know, a lot of times people think that they and their partners in crime are going to be able to stick together ultimately. How many people have said, "Well, I don't mind going to hell, all my friends are going to be there." Well, they won't be with their friends, even if they're all in hell. Besides, I think it's some pretty low view of friendship if you get some consolation knowing that your friends are being tortured with you. That somehow gives you comfort. Then it's hard to know what you think about friends. But the fact is that many people feel that their companions in crime will be their companions ultimately, and that's just not the case. These men were united in their evil deeds, but they will not be united ultimately. They'll be divided and scattered in Israel. Now, this was fulfilled differently for Simeon than for Levi. Simeon became a very small tribe. By the time of the second census of the Jews in Numbers chapter 26, Simeon already was the smallest tribe. It had diminished to the smallest tribe by the end of Moses' life. And when Moses gives his final blessing, which I mentioned already in Deuteronomy 33, he doesn't even mention Simeon. Apparently Simeon's tribe is so insignificant in size and so forth, he doesn't even mention it when he's blessing the various tribes. And it turns out that Simeon didn't even receive a portion in the sense of clearly defined geographical boundaries in the land of Canaan. They instead received certain cities that were within the borders of Judah. We have this from Joshua 19, verses 1 through 9, which describes the inheritance of Simeon. They only got certain cities given to them rather than a portion of land. And so they were scattered among the people of Judah, in various cities among the people of Judah. So they were scattered in Israel, among their brethren. Now Levi this was fulfilled of Levi in a different way. Because the Levites, due to a later act of zeal for God, at the incident where the golden calf was being worshipped, the Levites took the side of God and slaughtered the wicked. God adopted Levi to be the priesthood. And, of course, Moses and Aaron were both of that tribe. And the Levites were scattered also in Israel. But in their case, as a blessing. They also received no portion of their own in Canaan, but they had individual cities in every part. Every one of the other portions had Levitical cities where the Levites lived and they controlled these cities. So, you see, the Levites didn't need to have land. Most people needed land because they were farmers and they had to make their living. But the Levites didn't need land. They didn't have to make a living doing that because they were the professional clergy. And they were supported by the tithes of the people. And so they were given no land. They were just given cities to live in. And they were given some livestock and all just to have with them, but they didn't need a lot of land. But they were scattered throughout Israel too. So both Simeon and Levi were scattered, but for different reasons. Simeon, seemingly as a judgment, Levi more as a blessing. Because of his descendants being zealous for God in the days of Moses, they were given the privilege of being priests. Now we come to Judah, who is given the longest blessing, except for that of Joseph. It says in verse 8, Judah, thou art he whom thy brethren shall praise. Now this is a play on words. The name Judah means praise. And notice, this is the first of the sons that gets a commendation. This is because, as we mentioned before, Reuben, Simeon, and Levi lost the birthright. They would have been, in that order, in line for the birthright. As Reuben relinquished it, it would have naturally fallen to Levi, Simeon, and if he relinquished it, it would have naturally fallen to Levi. But since all three of them relinquished it through their conduct, and all received a curse, Judah, who is the first one commended, and probably the man of the highest character among them, he is the one who is praised, and he receives, of course, the spiritual birthright, though the physical fell on Joseph's family. He says to Judah, thy hand shall be in the neck of thine enemies. That obviously is in the position of advantage. And thy father's children shall bow down before thee. That happened because Judah gave rise to David and David's family, who were the kings of Judah and of the nation of Israel for a couple of generations there too. And so they were bowed to. And it says, Judah is a lion's whelp. From the prey, my son, thou art gone up. He stooped down, he crouched as a lion, and as an old lion, who shall rouse him up? Now, the language here is Hebrew parallelism. I'm not sure that we should give separate meanings to each of the lines. He's compared to a lion's whelp, to a lion, and to an old lion. These are all just parallel expressions, such as you find in Hebrew poetry all the time. Basically, comparing him with a lion is to speak of his royalty, the fact that even in ancient times, even to this day, we speak of the lion as the king of the beasts. The lion was the king of the forest, even in ancient times, undisputably. So Judah, who would give rise to the kingly family, was compared with a lion. And, of course, we remember how Jesus, in Revelation 5 and verse 5, is referred to as the lion of the tribe of Judah, because he came from Judah, and Judah is compared with a lion. By the way, that's the only place, Revelation 5:5 is the only place that Jesus is ever called Lion of the tribe of Judah, or where that term is used in the Bible at all. Verse 10 is highly significant. It says, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh come, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be. Now, the word scepter, of course, we know what that is probably. Some people would. A scepter is a staff or a rod of some kind, usually very ornate and very expensive, that is an emblem or a symbol of a king's rulership. In some countries, the scepter is kept in a vault, because whoever would get the scepter would be there, just by having the scepter, would be able to claim the throne. The scepter has that much symbolic value in nations that have kings. Now, we've never had a king here, so we might not be able to relate with it. But whoever had the scepter was the ruler. And so in speaking this way, it says, the scepter shall not depart from Judah. That means, of course, that Judah's family would be the kings. Nor a lawgiver from between his feet, which means his children would always be the lawgivers, until Shiloh come, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be. Shiloh is a word that has been debated over how it should be translated. A lot of liberal scholars who don't believe in predictive prophecy have tried to give it some kind of a meaning other than the natural meaning, but the natural meaning is Shiloh should be translated him to whom it belongs, or him whose right it is. That's what Shiloh means. Him whose right it is, or him to whom it belongs. So obviously what he's saying is the scepter will be held in the hand of the tribe of Judah until him to whom it belongs comes. That is, the one who has the right to hold the scepter, and that's namely a reference to Jesus, because it says, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be, meaning that the people, the nations of the world will gather unto Jesus. This is fulfilled, of course, in the preaching of the gospel to all nations, and we've gathered even ourselves. We're Gentiles, and we've gathered together unto him. In fact, there's a song we sing, we are gathering together unto him shall the gathering of the people be. It's from the scripture, we are gathering together unto him. Proclaiming that this prophecy is fulfilled in Jesus. There are some similar passages. I want to show you at least two other Old Testament passages that relate to this verse. One is Psalm 60 and verse 7. Psalm 60 and verse 7. The Lord says, Gilead is mine, and Manasseh is mine. Ephraim also is the strength of mine head. Judah is my lawgiver. Now, in speaking of these various tribes, Judah is singled out here as the lawgiver. And it goes back to this prophecy where it says, the scepter will not depart, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh come. So, only affirming some few thousand years later, actually about 1,000 years and some odd later, that this is fulfilled. The lawgiver is in the tribe of Judah. David, who wrote the psalm, probably. It is David's psalm, 60. He's implying that the prophecy is fulfilled in himself. By the way, David was the first king of Israel to be of the tribe of Judah. Saul, the only king that preceded David on the throne, was of the tribe of Benjamin. And, but he was rejected, and David and his seed sat on the throne as long as Judah had a king after that. And so once the scepter came to the hands of Judah, it didn't depart from Judah until Shiloh came. In Ezekiel 21, there is an allusion to this prophecy, which confirms our interpretation of the word Shiloh as him to whom it belongs. It's Ezekiel 21, verses 26 and 27, a very interesting prophecy which is talking about the overthrow of Jehoiakim, or Jeconiah, the last of the kings of Judah before the Babylonian captivity. Ezekiel is predicting that the last king of Judah will fall to Babylon, just as was predicted. And it says in Ezekiel 21:26, "Thus saith the Lord God, remove the diadem," or the crown, "and take off the crown. This shall not be the same. Exalt him that is low, and abase him that is high. I will overturn it." That is the crown. I will overturn the kingdom. And the house of David was on the throne, and he's basically saying, I'm going to overturn the kingdom, and it shall be no more until he come whose right it is, or until Shiloh come, in other words. Until he come whose right it is, and I will give it to him. So he's basically saying that from the time of the Babylonian captivity on, there won't really be, the crown won't rest on the head of any individual until he comes whose right it is, and God will give it to him, namely Jesus. It's interesting that after the Babylonian captivity, there never was a king in Judah, because Zerubbabel, who happened to be of the kingly line, he was a direct descendant from David and the kingly line, he was not made king, but he was made governor. And never was there actually a king of the house of Judah on the throne after the Babylonian captivity. Nonetheless, there wasn't really a king of any other house either, so the scepter really hadn't departed from Judah. It hadn't been given to anyone else. The nation simply didn't have a king for a long time. In Jerusalem, there reigned no king for 400 years, or actually 600 years. And it wasn't until about 40 BC when the Romans appointed Herod to be the king of the Jews that the Jews really got upset, because this seemed to violate the prophecy uttered by Jacob, because the scepter was departing from Judah. Because Herod was not of Judah. Herod wasn't even Jewish. He was Edomite. And so many of the rabbis at the time when Herod took control said, "Woe unto us, for the scepter is departed from Judah, and Shiloh is not yet come." But of course we know that it was in that same generation that saw the scepter depart from Judah and into the hands of Herod, Shiloh came at that time. And so the prophecy basically points to even the time of Jesus coming. The time at which the scepter really passed from Judah would be the time when Messiah would come. And it wouldn't pass from Judah before that time. Well, going on, the prophecy further talks about how he'd bind his foal to the vine and his ass's colt unto the choice vine. He washed his garments in wine and his clothes with the blood of grapes. His eyes shall be red with wine and his teeth white with milk. We might try to affix some mystical meanings to this, Jesus being the vine, riding on the foal of the ass, or binding the foal to the vine, or whatever, or washing his garments in the blood of grapes. We think of a prophecy in Isaiah that talks about him that comes from Edom and from Bozrah has washed his garments in blood and so forth. Apparently a messianic prophecy, but really probably this doesn't have too many hidden meanings. It's mainly a poetic way of saying he's going to prosper. He's going to have vines. He's going to have, as it turns out, the best wine in Israel, according to later scriptures we have it, was grown near Hebron and En-Gedi, which were both in the tribe of Judah's inheritance. And the reference to the milk, his teeth white with milk and his eyes red with wine, simply means they'll have a lot of it. The milk, of course, is from cattle, and the best cattle country was in the pasture land south of Hebron, also in the land of Judah. So it's essentially saying that Judah's inheritance will abound in milk and wine, which it's like flowing with milk and honey. It's a statement of fruitfulness, prosperity, and so forth. Zebulun, it says in verse 13, shall dwell at the haven of the sea, and he shall be for an haven of ships, and his borders shall be unto Zidon. Now in Joshua, we don't get any we don't get any reference to any sea on the border of the tribe of Zebulun. Zebulun is apparently landlocked. But I believe there must be something more than is recorded, because he must have been on the border of the sea, because there's other references to Zebulun on the sea. For instance, in the prophecy Moses uttered in Deuteronomy 33:19, there's a reference to the sea and Zebulun. It says in Deuteronomy 33:18-19, Zebulun said, Rejoice, Zebulun, in thy going out, and Issachar in thy tents. They shall call the people unto the mountain. They shall offer sacrifices of righteousness, for they shall suck of the abundance of the seas and the treasures hid in the sand. A reference to the sea again with respect to Zebulun. And even later, Isaiah chapter 9 speaks of the land of Zebulun by the seaside. The people who sat in darkness have seen a great light. And it's quoted in Matthew 4 about Jesus' early ministry. Interestingly, in Matthew chapter 4 and verse 15, it says, The land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali by the way of the sea, beyond Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles, the people that sat in darkness saw great light. Now, this is quoted from Isaiah 9:1 and 2, that Zebulun was by the way of the sea. And it is said to be fulfilled in the fact that Jesus' ministry began at the Sea of Galilee. And while we don't have record in Joshua of Zebulun's borders touching the Sea of Galilee, yet it must have at one time, or at least at one point, because so much in the Bible refers to it that way. It's just not mentioned in the distribution of the land later. Issachar we mentioned, verses 14 and 15. There's not really any comments I could make about that. In Dan, in 16 through 18, Dan shall judge his people. Another play on words. The name Dan means judging. As one of the tribes of Israel. Samson, by the way, was of this tribe. He was one of the judges of Israel. Maybe there's a reference there to him. But a very difficult verse, 17. Dan shall be a serpent by the way, an adder in the path that biteth the horse heels, so that his rider shall fall backward. I have waited for thy salvation, O Lord. This is the first reference in the Bible to salvation. I have waited for thy salvation, O Lord. And it seems strange that it's interjected here. He's talking about Dan, and all of a sudden he says, I have waited for your salvation, O Lord. I don't know what that's referring to. Some of the church fathers actually thought that the Antichrist would come from the tribe of Dan. And they thought the reference to the serpent there was a reference to the Antichrist. And maybe the I have waited for your salvation, O Lord, is sort of looking forward to tribulation or something and just saying, oh my goodness, can't wait till the Lord comes and ends it all. But apart from the statement of some of the early church fathers on this point, we don't have any way of understanding this. By the way, some have thought it significant, and the church fathers, some of them who thought this referred to Antichrist thought it was significant, was that in Revelation 7, where the 144,000 Jews are listed each by their tribes, 12,000 of each tribe, the tribe of Dan is not mentioned in that list. But to me, I don't know that we can make too much of that. Verse 19, Gad, a troop, shall overcome him. Gad means a troop, another play on words. But he shall overcome it at last. The fulfillment of this we can't identify. 20, out of Asher, his bread shall be fat, and he shall yield royal dainties. I suppose the best we could say about this is that Asher's land, as it turned out, was very rich in corn and in oil. Corn and oil. They had a lot of olive trees in that area, and that's where their oil came from. And, of course, corn or grain and oil would be what you'd make your pastries out of, and that might be what's mentioned. He shall yield royal dainties. Verse 21, Naphtali is a hind let loose, or like a deer set free. He giveth goodly words. Who knows what that means? I mean, it's interesting, but we don't have any record of its fulfillment in the Bible. Then we have Joseph. The longest is prophesied of him. Joseph is a fruitful bough, even a fruitful bough by a well, whose branches run over the wall. The archers have sorely grieved him, meaning his brothers, and shot at him and hated him. And his bow abode in strength, and his arms, the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. From thence is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. Not from Joseph, but from the mighty God of Jacob is the shepherd, the stone of Israel, apparently in reference to Jesus. He comes from God, not from Joseph, however. Now, by the way, the reference to Joseph as a fruitful bough, we could discuss many theories about what that means, but a bough by a well reaching over the wall. If we think of Joseph at all as a type of Christ, we could see that Jesus once sat by a well, and there he reached his boughs over the wall of partition between Jews and Samaritans. The first non-Jewish person converted was at a well, and a wall was breached at that point, a branch reached over the wall there, a middle wall of partition that was later broken down in the cross, according to Ephesians. But it says, even by the God of thy Father who shall help thee, and by the Almighty who shall bless thee with blessings from heaven above, blessings of the deep that lie under, blessings of the breast, blessings of the womb, blessings of thy Father have prevailed above the blessings of my progenitors unto the utmost bound of the everlasting hills. They shall be on the head of Joseph and on the crown of his head of him that was separate from his brethren. Blessings, blessings, blessings on Joseph. It's clear that he wants to really pour out all the blessings on this one son. He says, him that was separate from his brethren. The word in Hebrew is Nazir, which later we get the word Nazarite from in the book of Numbers, the law of the Nazarite, chapter 6 of Numbers, I believe it is, the separate ones. And a person who'd separate himself unto the Lord would become a Nazarite. Joseph was separate from his brothers geographically, but he was also separate from his brothers spiritually speaking. He was really separated unto the Lord, unlike his other brothers, and so he was in more than one sense separate from his brothers. Benjamin, verse 27, shall raven as a wolf. In the morning he shall devour the prey, and at night he shall divide the spoil. We don't know exactly how that's to be understood. We do know that at least some Benjamites later were quite fierce people. The first of the judges, Ehud, was a Benjamite, a left-handed Benjamite, and treacherously stabbed a very fat king named Eglon. The issue is made that he was so fat that the hilt of the sword disappeared in his fat. But he was of the tribe of Benjamin, Ehud, in Judges 3:15. Also, of course, King Saul and his son Jonathan were of the tribe of Benjamin. They were warlike men. And, of course, the Apostle Paul was of the tribe of Benjamin also. He was quite a spiritual warrior. I don't know what else we could say about this prophecy except that it does speak of a warlike people. And the Benjamites were a warlike people. In the end of the book of Judges, we find that though they were a little tribe, they warred against the rest of the tribes of Israel and put up a good fight. But they lost, as it turned out. Then it says in verse 28, all these are the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is it that their father spake unto them, and blessed them, every one according to the blessing they blessed. Then he reminded them he wanted to be buried at Machpelah. He'd already said that before. And he mentions that Abram and Sarah were buried there. And when he had finished all that, in verse 33, he made an end of communing with his sons. He gathered up his feet into his bed and yielded up the ghost and was gathered to his people. That is to say, he died. And then Joseph fell upon his father's face and wept upon him and kissed him. And then we have the story of how Jacob was embalmed after the manner of the Egyptians. The embalming process was lengthy, and at the end of it, Joseph obtained special permission from the Pharaoh to take his father and bury him back in the land of Canaan. When he did so, not only Joseph and his sons, but all of the brethren went with him, and all of the court officials of Pharaoh went too, so it was a tremendous company of people that went and accompanied Joseph to the burial of his father. And the people of the area where he was buried were amazed by this great retinue of mourners. And it says in verse 11 of the chapter, the local people gave the name of the place Abel Mizraim, which means it literally means the meadow of the Egyptians, but by a very slight change of the Hebrew vowel points, it can mean the mourning of the Egyptians, mourning as in mourning for the dead, and made an impression on them. Finally, verse 14, and Joseph returned unto Egypt, he and his brethren, and all that went up with him to bury his father after he had buried his father. And when Joseph's brethren saw that their father was dead, they said, Joseph will peradventure hate us, and will certainly requite us all the evil which we did unto him. They thought all this friendliness he'd shown toward them was just a show. He was really seething with bitterness but he couldn't do anything to them while his father was alive because it would grieve his father to see it. So they thought, now Dad's dead, we're in trouble now. And they sent a messenger to Joseph, saying, my father did command before he died, saying, so shall you say unto Joseph, forgive, I pray thee now, the trespass of thy brethren and their sin. For they did unto thee evil, and now we pray thee, forgive the trespass of the servants of the God of thy father. And Joseph wept when they spoke unto him. He wept because they so misunderstood his heart. And his brethren also went and fell down before his face, and they said, behold, we be thy servants. And Joseph said unto them, fear not, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, you thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass that it is this day to save much people alive. Now therefore fear ye not, I will nourish you and your little ones. And he comforted them and spake kindly unto them. He was grieved that they still didn't see the hand of God in all that had happened. He did. And he said, yeah, you might have wished it for evil, but God had a purpose in it. And that's, of course, the greatness of Joseph is seen in his acceptance of all things from the hand of God. Just like Job, when his problems first befell him, he said, the Lord gives, the Lord takes away. The Lord has the right to do that. Shall we not receive evil from the hand of the Lord as well as good? In all these things, the book of Job says, Job did not sin with his mouth or charge God falsely. He saw that even though evil was being brought to him, even at the hands of wicked men who killed his servants and took his camels and so forth, yet it was God who took them from him. And that, of course, is the key to survival, spiritual survival in a world of trials. You have to see the sovereignty of God and the hand of God in everything that happens. If you can, and if you can trust that God is on your side, as is the way it always turns out when you see the issue of what follows, the sequel of your problems, it's evident that you'll be able to cruise through your trials a little better, a lot better. Makes all the difference in the world if you can trust that God has it in control than if you don't. And so he says to his brothers that you meant it for evil. But look, it was God's plan. God was in it. God meant it for good. Look how it kept us all alive. Joseph is a type of Christ in this respect, that his sufferings accomplished the salvation of his people. And he accepted that. He saw that as good. Finally, verse 22, and Joseph dwelt in Egypt, he and his father's house, and Joseph lived 110 years altogether. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children to the third generation. The children also of Machir and the son of Manasseh were brought up on Joseph's knees. And Joseph said unto his brethren, I die, and God will surely visit you, and bring you out of this land into the land which he sware unto Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And Joseph took an oath of the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and ye shall carry up my bones from hence. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. Now Joseph, according to Hebrews 11, by faith, on his deathbed, he spoke of the departure of the children of Israel from Egypt and gave command concerning the taking of his bones. He'd lived many, many years in Egypt. And though he was dying there, he still believed that would not be where they'd end up. And so he took an oath of them and made them swear that they'd take his bones out. And upon his death, his body was embalmed and put into a typical coffin, Egyptian kind of coffin, in the shape of a body. And for hundreds of years, that coffin stood in Egypt as a constant reminder that, because there was that oath affixed to it, that these bones are going to be taken out of Egypt someday, sort of a constant reminder that though they fell into slavery and oppression later on, that body, that coffin, was going to be removed someday, because God was going to send deliverance. And he promised it on his deathbed. God will surely visit you. He shall carry you out of here, and you carry me out of here when you go. And sure enough, when Moses later led the children of Israel out, they did make a point of getting Joseph's remains and taking them and burying them in Canaan. All right. Well, we finish then with the story of Joseph.